but we're being sold a 22nd century Jetsons future built on Flintstones balance sheets, right? We've got, space-based solar power is the Concorde of energy. It's a breathtaking technology marvel, but I have real doubts about its financial viability, even when you look at reduced costs of Starship.
From the Defense and Aerospace Report, this is The Downlink, a podcast about the intersection of space, the space business, and defense. Not just what's over the horizon, but what's happening above it. I'm your host, Laura Winter. If you haven't yet heard, Starship version 3 is nearly ready for a test launch. Starship is SpaceX's next-generation super heavy rocket. It's so big, it's the tallest rocket ever built, standing at more than 124 meters. It's taller than even NASA's Space Launch System, which just sent astronauts around the moon. SpaceX is targeting May 19th for this test, which will launch from Starbase in Boca Chica, Texas. Many space businesses are hopeful because when Starship is certified and goes into commercial service, it will close out a lot of business cases that are currently on hold. But not every business case needs Starship to close, at least not right away. And that is exactly what one of my guests is saying about his company's bid to develop and commercialize space-based solar power, which is where this episode really begins. And I have to declare something before we get into it. I want space-based solar power to work. I think it has the possibility of changing the world. But financial questions remain. One financial expert that regular listeners will be familiar with is George Pullen, chief economist at Milky Way Economy. He loves big, bold, deep tech, but he's not convinced the business case closes. Joining him for this discussion is Martin Soltau and Richard Winslade of Space Solar, a space-based solar power company in the UK. Martin is co-founder and CEO, and Richard is the chief financial officer. And if you're new to space-based solar power, here's what it is. Space-based solar power, or SBSP, is exactly what it sounds like. Satellites in orbit collect sunlight, convert it to energy, and beam that energy back to Earth as radio waves to a ground receiver called a antenna. The radio waves are then converted into electricity, which could then be fed directly into the grid 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, regardless of weather, regardless of whoever eventually controls the Strait of Hormuz. That's the promise. Dependable, secure energy. To put the economics in plain terms, American households are currently paying an average of 18 cents per kilowatt hour for electricity. That's $180 per megawatt hour, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration as of this month. Martin Soltau believes his company can deliver power from orbit at $30 per megawatt hour. If Martin is right, that could be a $150 savings per megawatt hour. George Pullen wants to see how. I must also give a warning here. There is some financial and technical jargon. For instance, when George uses the word alpha, he means the extra return that justifies an early and substantial investment. But if SBSP works, it will have geopolitical implications on Earth and in space. As Richard put it in this conversation, we may one day measure the size of our economies not in dollars, but in megawatts. Whoever controls the power controls the future. Now here's our conversation. Martin, George, it's great to have you both back on the podcast.
Laura, it is great to be back.
A huge pleasure, Laura. Good to see you again.
Now, we've got a new guest on today as well, and that is Richard. Welcome. It's great to have you.
Hi, Laura. It's great to be here.
And we've got a lot to get into, so let's do a quick round of introductions and then dive right in. George, why don't you start us off and show them the ropes?
Sure. Happy to go first. Old hat here on the Downlink podcast. My name is George Pullen. I'm a space economist. I am the chief space economist for Milky Way Economy. We are a fifth industrial revolution think tank and consultancy. We also make investments into a variety of portfolio companies. The fifth industrial revolution, in case someone needs me to repeat it, is the space economy, which is when all of the wonderful things happening right now in the fourth industrial revolution gets translated up into space.
And Martin, tell us about the great work that you are doing with Space Solar.
Hello, I'm Martin Soltau. I'm the co-CEO and co-founder of Space Solar. My background is very much the aerospace and space sector, from putting reconnaissance on fast jets to working for Boeing and Lockheed on major programs. And Space Solar is developing space-based solar power. We've got a market-leading satellite design. We're a startup based at Harwell in the UK. Fantastic team, and can't wait to tell you more about it.
And you also have a letter of intent with Reykjavik Energy in Iceland, right? That was, I think, it's a couple years old, but you have that.
We do. We've had a lot of interest, actually. Reykjavik Energy was one of our early energy clients, hoping to start a pilot project with them. But we've got some real strong interest from defense, from National Grid, the energy system operator in the UK and the US, from our early energy clients who are going to be taking energy from our early systems. So there's been a huge amount of development since we last spoke, Laura.
And also the Middle East, no?
We had a really good engagement with the Middle East for some time, but we've been very focused on perhaps other more natural clients and partners.
Okay. And Richard, you are the one here at this table that is bridging the world of money and the world of physics. Tell us what you do at Space Solar.
That's right, Laura. And so I'm the Richard Winslade, the Chief Financial Officer at Space Solar. Was a physicist at Oxford by education, and then went off to do 21 years of technology investment banking, everything from equity research, M&A, equity capital markets, and a decade running technology, media, telecom advisory team at Royal Bank of Scotland, NatWest, which was a sort of debt and financing advisory focused team. Then I went off to the CFO world, first running funding at a open access fiber altnet doing small town USA. And then at Space Solar, where I help firstly to raise lots of funding and secondly to invest it wisely once we've got it.
Well, thank you guys so much for making the time to come here and have this discussion. Martin, you co-founded Space Solar in 2022. You have agreements in place, as I said before, and you believe space-based solar power, or SBSP, can be deployed on a commercial scale from 2030. You said exactly that in April of last year when your Cassidy engineering program concluded. George, you cover the space economy for a living, and your $4 trillion space economy forecast by the 2040s actually gets bigger if space-based solar power works. This would actually help everyone in the space economy. So your skepticism isn't ideological, it's economic. And Richard, you obviously are there as part of the Space Solar team, so we know where you land in all of this. So let's get into it. George, the entire SBSP business case rests on one assumption, and that is Starship. That Starship drives launch costs down far enough and fast enough to close the levelized cost of energy equation. That is the LCOE. The all-in price of producing a unit of electricity over the lifetime of a system. But Starship remains unproven. Testing, sure, but unproven and behind schedule. Starlink's new version 3 satellites are still sitting in a factory because they are too large for the Falcon 9's fairing. So even SpaceX is waiting for Starship. So why is this important, though? Starlink satellites are always top priority for fairing space, even now, along with defense and NASA launches, meaning everyone else comes after. They will launch when space is available. It's kind of like flying on standby, but paying full fare. Every company whose business model depends on Starship is crossing every finger and every toe, and probably legs too, praying to the space gods that Starship will be ready for service sooner rather than later. Everybody is still paying today's prices, though, for rockets. The dedicated Falcon 9 now costs $74 million, and that fleet is booked generally 24 months out. Falcon Heavy, the most powerful commercial rocket currently flying, costs $97 million per launch. There is no published Starship commercial price, no open manifest, and no confirmed date for third-party payloads. What does that tell you about any business case that requires Starship to be commercially available, competitively priced, and accessible to any startup by 2030?
Ooh, well, I love jumping straight into the SpaceX and Starship talk. I think with
you
respect,
did call the valuation crazy pants, so I knew you'd love it.
I mean, I did. I mean, I think that's maybe the thing that I've gotten the most heat for since the last time I was on with you. Love you. No, but seriously. So I feel like, and this doesn't necessarily apply blanketly to Starship, nor does it apply blanketly to space-based solar power, but we're being sold a 22nd century Jetsons future built on Flintstones balance sheets, right? We've got, space-based solar power is the Concorde of energy. It's a breathtaking technology marvel, but I have real doubts about its financial viability, even when you look at reduced costs of Starship, which may or may not benefit the programs. Because remember, when you're bringing up space-based solar power units, you are then having to assemble these units. It is likely that the assembly of these units takes multiple Starships. And remember, Starship is just one of your potential solves. You still have Starship getting you to LEO, low Earth orbit. I know, no acronym zone, getting you to LEO. But then we have to get over to geostationary orbit, right? Because you want to be, 36,000 plus kilometers up if you're hitting that same point on the Earth, all day long. So that means you got to have some sort of orbital tug, right? And then we're not even talking about the insurance premiums that Lloyd's and everyone else is now extracting from new tech. So you're going to have the new tech of Starship plus the new tech of first deployments. Put those together, you're talking probably like 25% premium. That wipes out most of your Starship savings. So I'm really worried if an orbital assembly project going over 5 years and multiple launches doesn't just blow up any CapEx models.
Go on, guys. Rock, scissors, paper. Who wants to answer that?
I'll start. So whilst we need Starship class rockets, and I'd include New Glenn in this, for the capacity, because we're going to launch hundreds of tons for each satellite. Actually, we don't need the launch economics, the cost of each launch, to come down by an order of magnitude or something. Essentially, our model, and we've been pretty conservative in this, we're assuming around 100 million per launch for a Starship. We're assuming 100-ton capacity, payload capacity. So that's $1,000 per kilogram to low Earth orbit. And then we have a launch strategy which sees us into refueling, into a transfer orbit, and then solar electric propulsion up to circularize in a geosynchronous orbit. So that's all modeled out. And with the economics of Cassiopeia, which we can go into perhaps a little later, which gives us a really unfair advantage, we're delivering a levelized cost of electricity of $30 a megawatt hour with essentially, say, today's launch cost. It's not quite today's launch cost, but it's what we think Starship will start out at. So I very much reject
Martin, I'm going to jump in and just be kind to everybody. Well, why is that? And I know you're saying, well, we can save this for later. Well, let's not save that for later. Let's okay, why is that $30 important? Like, what's the comparative that says, right, this is an economic way to do things. Don't just leave it out there.
Sure.
Let's have it.
So remember that space-based solar power, as you say, I wouldn't call it the Concorde of energy, because Concorde implies extremely expensive, but it is incredibly capable. So it provides this baseload, dispatchable, so it does that very high value grid balancing, and it's exportable wirelessly anywhere in the world. So it's an incredibly high value source of energy, which can really reduce the cost of energy for consumers, industrial and household. And there are four components, I suppose, to what makes up that levelized cost of electricity. First of all, it's the cost of launch. Secondly, how the performance of our system, the specific power is the key performance indicator. How much power out of the rectenna on the ground can you get for every ton of spacecraft that you have to launch into orbit. Thirdly, the cost of capital, which we've modeled very carefully. And fourthly, these are hypermodular systems made in gigafactories, and we're looking at the production learning curves, which are going to bring down that unit production cost. So those four elements are absolutely key in working out the capital cost, the capex, and the levelized cost of electricity. And our KPI, that specific power, is we've got a market-leading KPI of around 800 watts per kilogram, which is a key component in our unfair advantage. Richard, I don't know whether you've got any other thoughts.
I'd just add on the cost advantage doesn't just come from the scale production. It also comes from shifting how you think about space systems from being these gold-plated, cannot fail under any circumstance because you've just blown away 100, 200 million if a single component fails, to a world where you can tolerate a sensible, let's say we're modeling sort of 1% to 2% a year level of failure of these modules. Because the same robotics that installed them in the first place is still there to swap out failed modules, and you can get much more towards sort of automotive grade or high-end aerospace grade electronics rather than what today is a very gold-plated space grade electronics. It's still very high-end. It's still more expensive than consumer electronics, but it's not the multiple orders of magnitude more expensive.
Yeah. I think the other thing I think that's changed in the last decade is the advent of this ultra-thin radiation-hard photovoltaics. I mean, the PV is quite a large mass component of the satellite. That's absolutely game-changing. You don't need the cover glass. And so already, we're working with University of Cambridge and others. They've got this in at the right performance today. What we need to do is bring down the unit production cost in volume production, but it's all been produced. So we're not looking at some massive step changes or disruptive breakthroughs in new materials or anything. Our design, which you mentioned, our Cassidy project, Laura, that was to take our Cassiopeia solar power satellite design, including all the ground station, to a concept maturity level 4. This is a very well developed design with all of the subsystems defined, all the performance elements. So, and that was funded and assessed by the UK Space Agency Office of the Chief Engineers team. So, we weren't marking our own homework. Okay, so but here's the thing that worries me, and that I'm like George. I really want space-based solar power to work. And I see it as a civilizational type of issue that we need to wrap our arms around and find a way to make it happen. However, what happens if Starship, if its commercial service slips to, say, 2028 or beyond, right? Because we have been seeing this slip and slip and slip. And you're not the only business that's depending upon Starship, like getting off the ground like yesterday. There's been businesses that have been built primarily only on this, and well, yours is too in kind of a way. But what does that do to your economics then? So we don't need Starship before 2035. So we have an incremental 5-year development program to our pilot plant, which is essentially a megawatt scale, small demonstration pilot plant in low Earth orbit at year 5, which is about 2030, 2031. And then we've got our first system is in low Earth orbit, our first commercial revenue generating system, low Earth orbit. But we could be using, if Falcon Heavy is still going, or certainly New Glenn, to do that. We're not reliant on Starship before our large-scale Eagle systems generating kind of 100 to 600 megawatts. So why don't you lay out that timeline then? Because I obviously have missed a step here, and that's good, right? Because this will help everybody, take the ride with you. So what is it that you want to launch first? And from what I'm understanding, it could go on a Falcon Heavy or go on another launch provider. And then what's next? Just so that it's really clear, and that you also have the ground side of things also figured out as well, because you got to have something to catch the photons, right? Sure. Yeah. So there are probably 3 technology strands to our roadmap. And then the first is the development and demonstration of the high efficiency power beaming, and the trick we're doing here and why we can make this lightweight spacecraft is that essentially we have a phased array radar, but it doesn't require mechanical stiffness. It's very flexible, lightweight layers, and we have a very clever way of synchronizing the aperture. And so the roadmap comprises a series of terrestrial inner space demonstrations to progressively demonstrate this kind of power beaming and our aperture synchronization in space. Alongside that, in parallel, the second technology is in-space assembly. And again, this is not complicated Mars rover type robotics. We're talking about a very structured environment here where we're building the carbon fiber reinforced plastic truss structure replicated many, many thousands of times. And so we have relatively simple crawler robots that assemble this. And we're actually building our latest generation of this. We've already built 2 generations. We're on the 3rd generation now, under contract with NATO. And again, we've got a series of in-space demonstrations to do that. And then we bring those together in the pilot plant. It's called Osprey Tower in year 5. And then I think the third strand of the development is making sure that we've really hitting this KPI, the lightweighting of the whole system. So that's our system level strand. Obviously, there's multiple other aspects to the program, and particularly on the ground system. It's about really thinking about us as a renewables developer, getting those grid connections, getting the grid codes established. And again, that's really valuable, the work we're doing with National Grid on those aspects.
I think that lightweighting, if I may interrupt, is a really key misunderstanding a lot of people have about space-based solar power. If you look at launch costs and you look at the cost of terrestrial solar, I can get maybe 10 times the revenue by operating 24/7 in orbit. But the launch cost is maybe 1,000 times the cost of the solar panels themselves. How can the economics possibly make sense? This is a crazy idea. And maybe oversimplifying some of the analysis, but that's the core of it. The other way to look at it is to start from the other way around, to say, well, okay, then we need to be able to weight reduce by order of magnitude 100 times to make this economic. How could we build a system that is weight reduced 100 times? And that's the thought process that we've been through with Cassiopeia, that has enabled us to come up with a design that delivers these economics even at today's launch cost. And if there is further upside in launch cost, great, wonderful, then we'll have amazing equity returns, but we can still deliver economic power at today's costs.
So, George, if the weight problem is solved, and if space solar can do this even at current day launch costs, does that affect your LCOE objection? Does that affect what you think kills the deal for you? Is there something that's outstanding?
Yeah, I mean, for the 3 parts of the roadmap, like my risks and concerns on each of the 3 parts, I mean, I think one of my concerns is as it scales, it's not just about cost per kilogram to orbit. It's also about cost and potentially dedicated launches, right? So if you are of a large form factor, right, but a small kilogram cost, but I can't fit other loads nearby, I'm going to upcharge you, right? So I don't know about shapes.
You're buying the whole rocket.
Yeah, you might have to buy the whole rocket, right? And I don't know their shapes. Yeah, and I don't know the shapes that they're dealing with, and maybe it's proprietary, so don't feel obligated.
No. It's easy. It's a very modular system. So we designed specifically to be launch agnostic, and we'll be taking the whole rocket. You're absolutely right. You've got to make sure that you care about the volumetric efficiency as well as the filling up the payload. 100%. Right.
Yeah. So you could be in a situation where maybe you're already costing in the factors for a whole rocket, right? Whether that be Blues or SpaceX's, or maybe if ULA figures out how to make more heavies, it'll be theirs, right? And so, but
Ariane,
one of the big 3.
Maybe Ariane could actually put some more rockets together and, get in on the heavy lifting. I know.
I'm not going to throw it until they prove it.
It's been, I know. I hear you. It's
that was
been
very
a grind.
nice of you.
I was just trying. I'm trying to make a suggestion.
Yes. Out into the ether, may they hear us well. But I guess the next part of it is we're talking about assembly robots. And as someone who thinks about, second and third order effects, are the assembly robots lightweight? Are the assembly robots built with redundancies? Are we talking about the need for autonomy and swarming? I mean, those are hard things to do. We barely get that right on Earth most of the time, other than fancy light shows in China. How does that layer work? Mm-hmm. So that's another risk. I mean, you don't have to answer all three risks, but like that's a risk. And the other thing I worry about is like the competition that is coming on board from manufacturers, right? Like when we talk about, whether or not there's a lot of, meta materials being used here or not, it sounds like the materials that are your backbone are more commercially available. Is that right? Is that accurate?
They will require some level of adaptation to our purpose, but essentially we are taking the components that are commercially available, yes.
Okay. So then what I look at too is if we think about in particularly what's happening with AI for metamaterials and what AI is doing for advanced manufacturing and the creation of new materials, you're going to be seeing terrestrial use cases and development of these materials squeezing margins if the time to deployment gets elongated.
Okay, so that's scarcity driving price, scarcity of being able to have access to the machines and to the factory floors, and therefore the end product, which is, while commercially available, may or may not be slightly specialized. It's still going to be competition for that. And then there's a question of priority, as in, which company's order gets priority to fill first. But George, now that I've explained all that, I want you to name the risk that you would like these guys to get after, because we are under a time crunch, right? So we may not be able to go through every single one, but I would like you to choose one of what you just explained that you think is really the nub of what you want solved.
I think if we look at the levelized cost of energy over a long period of time, the punchline is that it hasn't been very level. And so whatever we, as a former energy trader, right, I'll just call it how it is. Like it's never that level. It's always changing. And so long-term contracts can help with that, right? And so the ability to land long-term contracts for offtake is obviously important. What I worry about is assumptions that the Earth-based technology is remaining static. Mm-hmm. Right.
Well,
so
let me just illustrate this though in a way, because I actually had a question teed up, and I would like to make this relevant to those that are not energy traders like yourself. Former. But let's just make this real, right? So gasoline here in the United States is $4.50 a gallon this week. So that's up more than 33% from a year ago. The Strait of Hormuz has been closed since late February. 20 million barrels a day is it moving, and President Trump called the ceasefire, quote, on massive life support, unquote, just this week. There are no clear plans to reopen that strait, let alone keep it open. Add to that, last November here in Virginia, which is where I am, a Democrat named John McAuliffe flipped a seat that hadn't gone to a Democrat in over 30 years. In a district Donald Trump won in 2024, McAuliffe achieved this by running almost entirely against data center expansion into farm country. And it comes down to not just the fact that it scars farm country, but it also was and is continuing, because I live this personally, raising energy costs for household and industry all together in one go, right? So a state report had actually projected energy demand in Virginia would double over the next decade because of AI alone. So people are angry enough to cross party lines because of their electricity bills and their farmland. So there is a fluctuation here, but we're also facing something that we also know is coming. We know that energy is going to become more expensive. All the reports, all the indicators are pointing in that direction, right?
Unless we can develop space solar power.
There you go.
It's a really, really good point, George. So energy competition with other renewables. I think Laura has as ever, finger firmly on the pulse. The huge rise in energy demand
I pay Martin to say that.
needs all of these technologies. We need nuclear. We need, probably gas is going to be with us for a long time, and other technologies, geothermal and so forth, where they are.
Oh, you said first, Martin. Yeah, I was going to say advanced geothermal. Keep them in the hunt. Yeah.
But the thing about space solar power is, so geothermal is a good case in point, because it's geographically limited, and it's a big capital development. What it's difficult to do is scale, and space solar power, because of this hypermodularity, can really scale out at tens of gigawatts per year. That's a superpower I think almost no other energy source has, possibly gas. Space solar power stands on its own merits because it's got this incredibly unique combination of attributes. It's reliable, it's dispatchable, it's does that grid balancing and integration. It's going to be supremely affordable if Space Solar and others get their engineering right. It's scalable. It provides national energy security, and energy sovereignty, which is increasingly important. And all of these things together mean that you do space solar power whatever else was happening in the world, even if we didn't have any of these crises and conflicts. And I think the other exciting thing is that it's really going to democratize energy access, particularly for the nations that don't have enough energy. And that is a strong force for good in the world.
Well,
Laura thinks I'm having a rant.
Well, it's not really the rant. I'm just more conscious of time. And that's why I actually wanted George to actually just zero in on one of his things.
And I look at it and I'm like, okay, so we have science fiction hype versus economic opportunity costs, right? And if you have something that is pricing in the fact that there are terrestrial utilities and terrestrial options, and this isn't just like, this isn't just $1 trillion extension cord out into the universe for our power, but a viable next best option. That's how business cases gets closed. It's based on MBOs, right? It's like, this is the next best option. And if that's competitive with enhanced geothermal, with our next generation of storage, with our batteries are getting better by the day, right? With
nuclear,
next gen nuclear. Then there's space alpha there, right?
Yeah.
I think that's the case that just has to be made.
So here's the thing: in the UK, we have our energy costs are 4 times your costs in the US. 4 times. We have the highest cost of industrial energy anywhere in the world. We're trying to decarbonize, and it's just bringing it home how insanely difficult there is. And to these other technologies, next generation nuclear, carbon capture and storage, battery storage, there are huge uncertainties in the commercial unit economics of all of these. Yeah, there are uncertainties about
and let's
space.
not forget the Strait of Hormuz, because I'm sure that your energy prices in the UK and probably all across mainland Europe have just gone like through the roof and beyond, up to where the birds fly.
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah, so there are big uncertainties across all of these technologies, including space solar power, which hasn't been demonstrated at scale yet. So, for governments, they need options where they have this uncertainty, and space solar power is going to come. But it's important technology. Why would you not place a bet on it? Because it's a no regrets investment. Because it's going to be building, amongst other things, our capability in the space sector to assemble large assemblies and infrastructure in space. And that's really the catalyst technology and capability for the next sort of economic revolution in space.
Okay, so I have a thought here that I'm sort of putting forth on behalf of George a bit, because George has always taught me to think about new companies and how new companies can use what they're working on to maybe not get to the end goal right away, but to do things in steps, perhaps, right? To find revenue in other ways of doing things. And here's sort of an interesting example of this, right? Just this week, Atherflex rebranded as Cowboy Space. And it's space solar power company that has now decided to do a massive pivot, right? And as part of this, they also raised $275 million at a $2 billion valuation. When they raised $50 million last year, they really were a space-based solar power company. Now they say that they are building rockets and orbital data centers with space solar as their source for AI compute in orbit. but not for beaming to Earth. The CEO said directly the focus is on using that power in orbit for AI compute, but that it could alleviate the draw on the grid here on Earth. Would we still need space-based solar power systems dedicated to beaming power to Earth, or does keeping the power in orbit to power these high energy draws like AI and maybe quantum may do the same, though I believe quantum's power draws is less. Could that maybe solve some of these issues? Could this be a step in the right direction? George, you want to jump in, so jump.
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, when we talk about AI data clusters in space, like let's just get a couple things right from physics, right? Like convection. So if there's no air, you have to reject heat another way because you don't have air, you don't have water circulating. So that means you have to reject it via radiation. Radiation is incredibly inefficient as compared to convection. And the second is that these AI clusters, if they're getting power from arrays that are also in geo, then that means these radiators have to be enormous, and they also have to be hardened against the radiation, not the kind they're trying to get rid of by radiating away heat, but the radiation that they're experiencing. And if you're way up there, you're talking about 500 milliseconds or more of latency, which
George, you are
AI is a lot. Okay, so all that being said, like, $2 billion.
You are my inconvenient friend. Yes,
$2 billion. Hats off, right? But there's two things that AI data centers and large infrastructure projects like this are going to run into that you're not going to see on the Cowboys pitch deck, and that's that they're not going to talk to you about the real black swan risks of the spectrum wars and security, because whether you're talking about beaming back AI crunch data, we're talking about beaming back microwave frequencies of energy. This is something that is already participating in a crowded Wi-Fi and SATCOM environment. And we have not figured out downmass. And when I talk about downmass, I'm talking about data downmass. Data downmass has not been solved. And so that worries me about that business case. I think that space-based solar power for space-based infrastructure is a great pivot. I think it makes a lot of sense. You remove the need for multiple kilometer sized receivers on Earth, and you have, product closest to market, right? Because it's energy being captured in space and being used in space. I think that's great. And then we just have to just say like the obvious thing, which is we're talking about security risks here, right? These are multi-billion dollar, $2 billion, right? Multi-billion dollar hostages in orbit that, as far as I can tell, we have no real plan on how we're going to defend. And so that's going to get really sticky. Even besides we get into like direct energy weapon stuff here, which we never got into today, which I'm fine with. But like just the AI data centers themselves are huge asset hostages that I don't know how we're going to defend commercially, how commercial participants are going to be feeling about how these assets are defended for them. In the same way, when we transport an LNG tanker, we were talking about natural gas earlier, we transport an LNG tanker from the Gulf over to our friends in Europe. We know they're protected because we have the US Navy. How is a data center in space protected? How is a space-based solar power system protected in space? Fill in the blank for me.
Sure. So some great observations there. And it is important to differentiate between data centers and space-based solar power. There are some similarities in that they are ultimately solving the same overall question of, how do we scale total power demand globally as AI scales? It's not completely the same question because there are other sources of demand growth in electricity. Just general electrification of transport and heating would justify a significant, probably a doubling of the power demand and a whole host of new energy supplies to drive that. But yes, in the more optimistic AI futures, AI is going to become the principal driver. In fact, we'll probably start to measure the size of our economies in megawatts rather than dollars once you remove human labor from the equation. It's not a magnification anymore. It is the economy. Specifically to the frequency wars, George, I think you're right on the orbital data centers point. It adds a lot of download need. For space-based solar power, we actually want to use the minimum frequency possible. We want a very pure single frequency because that increases the efficiency of conversion. So although we will need a frequency assigned, at the moment we're using 5.8 gigahertz in the unlicensed band, but eventually a assigned frequency will probably be needed. It's not going to tie up frequency that could be used for others in the same way that a communications allocation would be. In terms of security, I mean, so the orbital data centers, as I understand it, most of them are targeting sun-synchronous low Earth orbit, anywhere between sort of 500 and 1,000 kilometers. So a little bit more manageable in terms of latency, where you can be talking something not totally dissimilar to Starlink, but potentially more of an issue in terms of being easily accessible to orbital weaponry. With our systems, we're principally targeting geosynchronous orbits. While anything is ultimately targetable, it's going to be much easier to target the stuff in the Starlink constellations, the data centers, before you start targeting stuff out in geo. And secondly, the same reason that makes us economic makes us very defensible. So we are, firstly, highly modular, hundreds of thousands of modules. So you'd have to damage, a significant percentage of the modules before you took the system out of operation. And secondly, because they are so lightweight, a kinetic attack or even a micrometeorite naturally would be more like a bullet going through tissue paper than sort of a stone hitting glass. It would tear rather than shatter. So while every system has its own vulnerabilities, and I'm not saying we're completely invulnerable. If you want to take something out, you can. Relative to something like undersea power cables, vastly more secure, and there's a level of security just in variety, so that you're not getting all of your power from a single vector that your opponents can attack.
So George, I think Richard really brought something up that I think is really important, and you've also mentioned this to me as well, that whoever is really going to come out on top is going to be the one who has power, electrical power primarily, right? That it really is the key. And that made me kind of think about, when I was preparing for this, about how electricity utilities were first built, right? Nobody expected an immediate return on investment. They didn't even expect a return on investment probably 5-10 years down the road, but they did know that this was necessary for the whole economy, for a national economy, for a gross domestic product, right? So when you realistically think about returns on investment, and this maybe it should ultimately require government as the first capital mover in this. I'm wondering if really a return on investment should be measured in a different way, that maybe it really should be measured in terms of GDP growth as your return on investment, as opposed to just what you're selling at the time. Because if we don't have the electricity, if we don't have energy dominance, energy security, energy sovereignty, it's not just that the space-based solar power company is, having a rough time, but the whole economies need this electricity and need it to be there on demand when it's needed and at scale, whether it's AI or otherwise, right? So that's why I'm thinking about the utility as an analogy, or maybe a way of going forward. And I kind of wanted to get your thought on that maybe that return on investment needs to be widened to include what is the return on investment for a nation, because that's revenue for economic activity for the government. So that is a return on investment. It's just adjacent.
Yeah. So the question is, do we have the societal will for a Tennessee Valley Authority, a TVA, a Hoover Dam level project in space? And that's going to come down to what is the pain associated with not having that next kilowatt delivered to you when you need it? And what are we willing to pay for the backup, and what are we willing to pay for the industrialization? I think if we look at Earth, I don't think we're there yet in most urban areas, right? Like, you're not going to power the New York grid that way. I don't see the alpha there. But you know what? You could see that for powering cislunar manufacturing, right? Orbital defense relays, lunar water mining, all of those types of projects become, that next kilowatt delivered is so essential and so vital to the rest of the economics and the rest of the chain, that a project of that scale and that diversifies makes a lot of sense.
All right. So we've covered a lot today. This is a question for each of you, and I think we've lost Martin to a technical challenge, I imagine. But George, has anything we have discussed today changed your mind? Or is there something specific that would have to happen first, like government committing to space-based solar power? Is there something that could change that would change your calculus?
Right. I mean, I think what I hope your listeners get out of this is that I'm laying out a series of risks. The whole point of a business is to mitigate those risks and navigate their way to a return for the investors, right? So
whether that investor be private, commercial, or government.
Right. Sovereign, either way, right? They just have to navigate those risks. The stuff that I've heard, Richard share makes a lot of sense. I think that as the TRL rises, the technology readiness level increases, we're also just going to have to make sure that for this particular situation, we're also making sure that the financial readiness level is increasing lockstep, because there's a lot of alternatives and a lot of moving pieces for something that's this large and this long of a project time. So I'm not changed. My opinion hasn't changed, but I definitely see areas here where they're going after the solves that need to be gone after.
Okay. Martin has made it back on, which is just in time for the last question, which I'm tossing to both you, Martin, and Richard. And that is kind of a similar question, but it's from a different angle. Are there steps in between here where we are today and beaming power directly to Earth at scale, steps that could generate revenue more quickly and fund that end goal that you guys are striving to realize, which is beaming energy to the Earth at a price point that makes a profit for your company, but also makes electricity more accessible to everybody, right? Is there a path that gets you there faster?
I think that's a great question, Laura. The one thing I'd say is in-space assembly of large structures. It's right on our roadmap. It's part of our business plan, and it's going to be the next real accelerator of the huge economic revolution in space. Richard, what do you think? I mean, you're the guys who has gotten money to big, massive projects, and what do you see?
Very much in space assembly. It's both the commercial applications, things like orbital data centers, things like in-space manufacturing, but also some really interesting defense applications, which obviously we can't go into too much depth on. There are also some terrestrial applications for wireless power transfer. They're probably not the sort of multiple billions of valuation. They're smaller niches than that, but still real opportunities, things like charging drones, things like emergency power connections and backup power connections. But the big ones in space assembly.
George, Martin, Richard, thank you all so much for making the time to come on the podcast.
Laura, pleasure as ever. Thank you.
Really good to join you, Laura.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Martin. It was a fun debate. I appreciate you educating me on some of these things that your company's solving. And Laura, always a pleasure to be here with you.
That's it for this week. For your daily dose of award-winning defense coverage, listen to the Defense and Aerospace Report with Vago Muradian. And for the maritime domain, listen to Cavis Ships with Chris Cavis and Chris Cervello, and get your air domain news and analysis from the Air Power Podcast with JJ Gertler and Vago Muradian. I'm Laura Winter. Thank you for listening.